In the previous video, we created our first Lambda function. Now let's explore the API Gateway service. In this video, we are going to take a look at the API Gateway service web dashboard. We'll use it to create a new API and then connect that API to our Lambda function. Last but not least, we will test our API, and through our API we will invoke the Lambda function. I am logged into my management console in the Frankfurt region, where I have just created my first Lambda function. Now let's go to the API Gateway service. I don't have an API Gateway yet in this region, so let's get started. Amazon asks me to import an API. Okay, let's do it. So here's a reference API that you can use to learn more about APIs, but it's a bit too complex for our first use case. So let's create a simpler API by clicking on the Create API button. We create a new API. I give it the name First API. Then I click on Create API. So now I have an API and I can configure a couple of things, but for now let's just create a resource, so in the sense of a REST resource. I'll name it foo, and it gets the resource path foo, and I click on Create Resource. Now a resource alone is not enough, I also need a method, so let's create a method, and I select an HTTP GET method. Click on the little check mark down here. And voila! We have an API, a simple API with one resource foo and a GET method. Now we can integrate it with different kinds of services. We want to integrate it with our Lambda function, so the first radio button is correct. We select the region. We are in the Frankfurt region and our Lambda function is also in the Frankfurt region, so select EU Central 1. Which is the Frankfurt region, and then type in the Lambda function name. I gave it the name First Lambda. Click on Save. Now API Gateway asks you if you give API Gateway permission to invoke your Lambda function. So remember from the beginning, you need to give your API permission that it is allowed to invoke your Lambda function. Otherwise, just anyone could invoke your Lambda function, which you don't want. Click OK. Now we have created an integration between our API and our Lambda function. Let's click on the little test button up here. Now we can execute an HTTP GET request by clicking on the test button down here. And within 90 milliseconds we get a response back, hello from Lambda. So it looks like we really invoked our Lambda function. But can we be sure? Let's check. I go back, I click on the foo resource, click on the GET method. Now we see our integration again, and on the right hand side you can see the Lambda function that I have integrated my API with. This is a link, you can click on it, and you will be directed to the Lambda dashboard with your Lambda function. Let's take a look at the monitoring tab. And as you can see, in fact, it has just been invoked a couple of times actually. In this section we learned a couple of things. How to navigate the AWS web dashboard, the management console. We created and tested our first Lambda function. And then we created a REST API and we connected it to Lambda, then we invoked the API and through the API we invoked our Lambda function. As you can imagine, it can become quite tedious to create more complex applications if we do it all on the management console. The management console is great for getting started, but it's not the right tool for building serious applications. Would be great if there was a programmatic framework that would help us to do that. Thankfully there is. In the next section we will explore the serverless framework, which is a development framework that helps you to build serverless applications. See you there.